19mm socket. Let's take all 5 of the lug nuts off and then remove the wheel. Take the hubcap off, if you have one. Take the wheel off. 22mm wrench. Let's break free this jam nut. You can use a rubber mallet if it's very tight like this one. There we go. All right, surprisingly, this broke free, but that's good. 18mm socket, remove this nut right here. Now you want to hit the knuckle right here. That's going to break the tie rod stud free from the inside of the knuckle. There we go. Now you want to take off this outer tie rod and count the amount of turns that it takes to take it off. Of course, you'll still need an alignment afterwards, but this, if you put it on the same amount of turns that it takes to take it off, it will at least get you close. I had 25. Of course, for you, it's going to be different, but remember whatever number you have or write it down somewhere. Take this nut off. Take some needle nose pliers or whatever else you have and squeeze this clamp. Pull it right off of the inner tie rod. So at the end of the boot in there on the steering rack, there should be a clamp for which I would typically use a pry bar. Put it right up against it, hammer it, and within 1 to 2 hits, it should pop right off, and then this boot should be free. My boot is actually broken, so the clamp isn't doing anything anymore. So I can just pull this boot straight off. Obviously, it's going to need to be replaced. There we go. There's your boot. And then if you look in there, this is the clamp that I was talking about. Looks like this clamp is also broken, but typically it would go somewhat like this. And then you put your pry bar right up against this area, bonk it, it should pop open, then remove your clamp and your boot. This is the inner tie rod tool that I'm going to be using. They make different types. This one just clamps on to the inner joint and squeezes it so that you can grab this with a ratchet and spin it, or a breaker bar. So I just want to put it on here and tighten it up. The key to this is to make sure that it's actually nice and tight. That way it can bite into the tie rod. Otherwise it's just going to slip as you try to turn it. Stick your extension in there with a breaker bar or a ratchet and turn this to break it free. There we go. Now you can remove your extension. I'm just going to go ahead and remove my tool. It'll be easier to do now with the tie rod mounted as opposed to when it's in my hand. All right, and now remove your inner tie rod. There it is. Take your new inner tie rod. I put a little bit of red thread locker on the inner threads there. And start this on. Sometimes it's a little tricky because the shaft of the tie rod isn't lined up, so as you try to spin it, the inner threads are kind of wobbling around, but there you go. That's started. Let's tighten it up with our inner tie rod tool. Now when you tighten this, right now it's bottomed out. You don't want to go too far because you don't want to twist the whole rack internally. Just give it a quick snug. Once it bottoms out and it's snug, maybe like 1/8 of a turn at most, that's good. We have the thread locker on there. That's what's going to lock it in. Now I can remove my tool. The little packet of grease that came with your inner tie rod is meant to be used on this inner ball joint here. You just want to work that grease in. This is going to help it last as long as possible. There we go, just coat that whole area, work it in a little bit. And then the last drop of grease that I have in here, I like to put right on this ridge here. This is where the outer part of the boot sits. And what that's going to do is it's going to help the rubber slide when you go to get an alignment. As this tie rod turns, you don't want the boot to turn and twist with the tie rod, otherwise it'll rip. You want it to slide nicely. Put the boot on. Slide it on until it bottoms out on this lip here, and then we'll put the inner clamp on. If you don't have one of those single-use clamps that I showed you earlier, you can just use a wire tie and wrap it around there. So I'm going to take a wire tie. I'm going to start it on over here. That way it's already wrapped around. And I'm just going to push it all the way back to where it sits on the end of the boot there. Of course, make sure that it's engaging on the right area. Make this nice and snug. And then we'll come back and cut off the excess. With my needle nose pliers, I'm going to give it a twist. This will make it extra tight. And I'm going to come with some cutters and cut the excess off. There we go. Put your outer clamp on. Of course, if this one is weak and doesn't hold tension anymore, then go ahead and replace it either with another one or a wire tie, whatever works for you. But you want to make sure you secure this boot in some way or another. I like to coat the threads of the tie rod with some anti-seize. That way it prevents rust, and both the outer tie rod and the jam nut don't get stuck here in the future due to rust. Put on the jam nut, and I'm just going to drive it in. Take your outer tie rod and thread it on the same amount of turns that it took to take it off. I had 25 turns, so this is where I'm going to stop. I'm going to bring the jam nut a little bit closer. I'm going to tighten it at the end. I just want to bring it close. Take the castle nut off of your tie rod. Line it up with the knuckle. Make sure there's no debris here that can poke the boot. Press it through. Let's put the castle nut on. All right, now I'm going to snug it. Snug it up. 63 foot-pounds for this. That's it right there. Now if the cotter pin hole doesn't line up with the castle nut, then always tighten, never loosen to line up the next slot. And for me, it looks like I have to tighten a little more. A little more. Right there is perfect. Slide the cotter pin through and bend it over to lock it in. There we go. Now let's tighten up the jam nut to make sure that the inner and the tie rod are both secure. Snug it up. There we go, that's nice and tight. And then I like to bring it back a little bit so the outer tie rod doesn't sit at an angle on the knuckle. Perfect. Let's put the wheel back on. On this particular model, this hubcap has to go on before the lug nuts because it gets held on by the lug nuts. So just make sure you match up this slot here with your valve stem. Push everything on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Snug them up.